Introduction to Moral Philosophical Approach. Dear students, now just let me take you to another kind of literary criticism which you can use for your research and literature. And this is called the moral philosophical approach. The moral philosophical approach is basically the kind of approach which is used for a long time, which has been used for a long time by researchers and critics, because this is the approach in which literature is taken as an important source of moral guidance and spiritual inspiration, right? So this didactic role of literature is taken into account, and it is actually in harmony with a critical tradition, because the critical tradition, which has been there for a long time, is also based on this didactic and positive role of literature. Let me just quote the saying of Matthew Arnold, English critic. He was of the opinion that literature is basically very, very important. It's supremely important source of moral guidance and spiritual inspiration. And he actually considers that this is the role of poetry to delight us and to guide us, right? So the best poetry has a power of forming, sustaining, and delighting us as nothing else can, right? So that's the role which is expected from poetry, from literature. And while focusing on this role of literature, we can explore, the moral criticism of literature, and we can explore a particular piece of literature from this moral philosophical point of view, right? So this kind of moral criticism has a long history, and rather that is the longest history in the criticism, in the history of criticism. And the importance of literature is considered not just its way of saying, but also what it says, right? So the content and the form of saying, both are the substance and the form, both are considered very effective for didactic role, right? So critics who concentrate on the moral dimensions of literature, they often judge literary works by their ethical teachings and by their effects on readers, right? And of course, great teachers, they used to consider themselves as philosophers and teachers also, right? Those literary giants, okay? So literature is basically the kind of force which is ethically sound, and it encourages virtue, and the virtue is, of course, praised, right? So a literature that misguides and corrupts is condemned, and literature that guides is praised, right? So this role of literature has been there for a long time. And when you talk about this role of literature, a particular piece of literature, then you are concerned with the moral philosophical approach, right? So the greatest writers, as mentioned earlier, they have considered themselves as teachers as well as artists. And if you just go back to the saying of Plato, he considered the role of literature, and therefore he banished literary people from his republic. And this basically about the role of literary people, that they were capable of corrupting the morals and undermining religion, right? So this was one way, a consideration of the role of the effective role of literature, right? So literature has this effective role, and there are, of course, others like Aristotle and Horace, who not only admitted the value of literature, but they were, of the opinion that literature is capable of fostering virtues as well, right? So this is actually, the consideration of literature, of its capability to promote virtues and to foster virtues, right? And this delightful and instructive role of literature is evaluated under this kind of criticism, the moral philosophical approach. And the functions of literature are basically evaluated. And if I quote Samuel Johnson here, that literature, the function of literature is to teach morality and to probe philosophical issues. So you can evaluate and you can comment on this role of literature while focusing on a particular piece of literature. you can evaluate a poem from morality point of view. You can evaluate its role while discussing about, a drama or a novel. So this kind of research is basically related to the moral philosophical approach.